They say memory is fragile. That time turns stories into whispers and erases faces from the pages of history. But if you listen closely, beneath the roaring silence of textbooks and monuments, you'll hear the pulse of a forgotten America, beating in the dust-blown fields of the South, in the whistle of a train slipping past a segregated platform, in the calloused hands of a black mother stitching dignity into scraps of cloth during the Great Depression. This story isn't about the presidents or the powerful. It's about the lives history left behind. It's about 100 forgotten things from 1930s America. It was an era of breadlines and broken promises. The Great Depression didn't just shake the banks. It cracked the spirit of a nation. And yet, for Black Americans, depression wasn't new. It had another name: Jim Crow, oppression, survival. In the dusty corners of Alabama and the cotton-stained Delta, pain was not a crisis, it was a constant. But even then, beneath the weight of injustice, there was music, resistance, and hope stitched into every breath. Imagine a wooden schoolhouse, barely held together by nails and prayer. Inside, children huddle in coats through winter, chalk dust clinging to skin darker than the pages of the textbooks they were denied. The schools were separate and always unequal. But what's forgotten is to fight the teachers who taught by lantern lights, who built curriculums from nothing, who carved future scholars from the bones of exclusion. Their names rarely made the papers, but they carried the weight of legacy. And what of the traveling Pullman Porters? To white passengers, they were invisible men in crisp uniforms, attending to bags and beds with silent precision. But on their off hours, these men passed newspapers. The Chicago Defender, smuggled across states like contraband. Those papers were freedom folded in newsprint. Stories of dignity, resistance, opportunity. These porters were the underground network of information, knowledge, and black pride stretching across the rails of a segregated nation. Most people forget that in 1930s America, black farmers were systematically cut out of the New Deal. Programs promised aid, but it was filtered through the white. In the Harlem tenements and Chicago's Bronzeville, music hummed through cracks in the walls. This was the age of swing, of juke joints hidden in alleyways, of Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit for the first time in 1939, her voice trembling like the truth hanging from the poplar trees. That song wasn't entertainment. It was an indictment, a warning, a lament, and a promise that silence would never be safety. Then there were the forgotten black inventors, like Garrett Morgan, who, despite his groundbreaking work, was erased from credit lists, or Lewis Latimer, whose patents lit the world, but whose name flickered into obscurity. Their brilliance was a contradiction to every lie America told about who belonged in science, who deserved genius. But their light endured, even as their names were scrubbed from classrooms. There were also stories buried under pain, like that of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 black teenagers falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a train in Alabama. In 1931, they were barely older than children, but they were sentenced like men, sentenced like animals. Their trials, full of lies, bias, and courtroom mockery, would stretch for years, exposing the country's festering wound. Some say justice came too late. Others say it never came at all. But the image of those boys, young, scared, and proud, still haunts America's reflection. And in the fields of Florida and the Carolinas, there were black midwives, granny midwives, they were called. Their hands caught generations of life, often without formal training, without modern tools, and always without recognition. Hospitals were segregated, medical schools ignored them, but they were the first breath for thousands of black babies. They carried ancient wisdom passed down through mothers and grandmothers, blending African traditions with the desperate improvisation of necessity. Even in tragedy, the 1930s had its heroes. One such name was Oscar Mishotha, son of formerly enslaved parents, who dared to write, direct. Do you know about the Bronzeville Renaissance? It's not as famous as Harlem, but in 1930s Chicago, Bronzeville was alive with culture, protest, and pride. Jazz clubs spilled onto the streets, art bloomed in basements, and newspapers gave voice to local fights. This was not a people waiting to be rescued. This was a people building kingdoms out of concrete. There were black soldiers, too forgotten by medals, remembered only by each other. They served in segregated units, trained with second-hand weapons, often sent to the most dangerous fronts. And when they returned, they were denied jobs, housing, even the right to vote. But they still wore their uniforms with pride. Because to them, dignity wasn't given, it was carried. And let us not forget the black nurses, who were barred from the Red Cross and many hospitals during the early 1930s. They formed their own associations, held their own training, and when polio or tuberculosis spread through the South, it was these women, underpaid and underrecognized, who stepped in. They didn't wait for permission to save lives. In small towns like Mound Bayou, Mississippi, founded by formerly enslaved people, black self-governance thrived. The town had its own doctors, newspapers, and schools. It was a vision of what freedom could look like, carved out in a state built on chains. Places like this weren't anomalies, they were dreams realized, however briefly. So much has been forgotten, not because it wasn't important, but because it was too important. Because remembering means reckoning. It means understanding that black Americans didn't just survive the 1930s. They resisted it, reshaped it, and bore its weight with a grace America did not deserve. There are still elders alive today who remember the pain of that decade, who remember the taste of government cheese, the humiliation of secondhand shoes, the way the air changed when a white man got too close. But they also remember joy, the smell of Sunday dinners made from scraps, the first note of a church choir rising through rafters, the feel of dirt under fingernails, and the pride of a garden that fed an entire block. This is only half the story. The rest is still buried in attics, photo albums, and front porch memories. These are the 100 forgotten things from 1930s American, the kind you find in museums, but the kind that still live in bloodlines, in scars, and in songs. And they deserve to be remembered, not as artifacts, but as acts of defiance, endurance, and grace. There's a sound that never leaves a generation, the rustle of protest in cotton skirts, the hush of prayers whispered under breath, the low moan of gospel behind closed doors. For Black America, in the 1930s, every sound was a thread in a greater tapestry of resistance, and every forgotten thing was a stitch in the soul of a people who refused to break. Let us return now to the fields, where the hands of black women picked cotton under the same sun their ancestors once worked beneath. The work was backbreaking. The wages, if they came at all, were barely enough to eat. But still, there was pride in that labor. Because for many, those hands also built churches on weekends, sewed clothes from flour sacks, and turned Sunday into a sanctuary. The dignity of the domestic sphere, the quilts, the cooking, the stories told by lamplight was never recorded in ledgers or history books. But that's where much of the real resistance lived. There was something else most people forget. Black families weren't just victims of poverty. They were denied the very tools that created middle-class wealth. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, created during the Depression, introduced redlining, drawing thick red marks around black neighborhoods, labeling them hazardous for investment. This wasn't accidental. It was engineered exclusion. It meant no loans, no insurance, no safety net. So instead, families formed susu circles and formal savings groups based on West African tradition. $1 at a time, they bought homes, opened shops, sent children to college. The banks said no. The community said, we'll find our own way. And they did. Black newspapers, like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Baltimore Afro-American, didn't just report news, they shaped movements. They held contests to support young scholars, organized boycotts of racist businesses, and offered platforms for voices that the mainstream press ignored. Journalists like Ida B. Wells and Ethel Payne didn't just write, they roared. Their pens were protest, and their words made readers believe they were not alone in their fight. In the quiet corners of church basements, there were strategy sessions, long before the Montgomery bus boycott, long before Selma. Women like Nannie Helen Burroughs and Mary McLeod Bethune Organized, educated, uplifted, Bethune built schools with her bare hands and the faith that knowledge could be liberation. She walked through the halls of power in Washington, the only black woman among President Roosevelt's advisors, known as the Black Cabinet. She didn't speak softly. She reminded America that its promise had been broken and that it would be held accountable. Meanwhile, black artists pushed back in paint, in poetry, in prose. Jacob Lawrence painted history in motion, bold, raw, and urgent. Zora Neale Hurston, with a pen dipped in the folklore of the South, gave voice to black womanhood that didn't ask for permission. She told stories the way they were lived, full of color, laughter, betrayal, and unshakable strength. She wrote of a people whose spirits refused to bow. Down in Louisiana, the Creole community fought for its identity amidst the tightening grip of Jim Crow. Light skin didn't save them passing, didn't protect the soul. Those who could pass faced a heavy burden, cutting off family, culture, memory. And those who didn't pass bore the full weight of a society built to erase them. But they held on through food, music, faith, and family. Gumbo wasn't just a meal. It was a resistance, a preservation of roots in a world that kept pulling at them. There were also the union struggles, quieted in today's retellings, but fiery in their time. Black workers in Alabama mines and Detroit factories demanded dignity from companies that exploited them twice, once for their labor and again for their race. White unions tried to shut them out, so black workers formed their own. They walked out, they picketed, they built solidarity across race lines when it was dangerous to do so. They reminded everyone that class struggle without racial justice was just another form of erasure. And then there were the forgotten migrations. Most know about the Great Migration, but few speak of the reverse, when black families were recruited to labor in California's fruit fields, only to find racism had traveled west with them. They slept in tin shacks, worked sunup to sundown, and faced sundown towns where a black face after dark meant violence. But even there, resistance bloomed. Jazz made it to Oakland. Protest songs echoed through Fresno, and communities held dances in church halls as a way to remember they were still alive, still human, still whole. Do you remember the names? They weren't always famous, but they mattered. Clara, who taught her students to write poetry about freedom, even when the principal warned her not to. Thomas, who walked 5 miles every day to work at the shipyard, not because he loved the job, but because his daughter dreamed of college. Lula, who refused to move to the back of the streetcar in 1937 and was nearly beaten for it, but who stood her ground, shaking but unbowed. And the black men wrongfully convicted in small-town jails across the South, held for crimes they didn't commit, simply because they were easy to blame. Their stories didn't make headlines. Their names weren't cleared. But behind bars, many found purpose, teaching each other to read, finding God, writing letters that would one day be found by grandchildren who would march for their names. In the forgotten chapters of the 1930s, there were black cowboys still riding in Texas and Oklahoma. Real ones, not the myths. Their hats were worn, their boots dusty. They rounded cattle, mended fences, slept under stars that knew their secrets. Hollywood erased them, but their grandchildren remember. Some still ride today, carrying forward a legacy the movies never told. And there were the beauty salons and barbershops, black spaces untouched by white authority, where people gathered not just for grooming, but for storytelling, for strategy, for solidarity. These were the meeting halls of the ordinary, the places where gossip became activism, where style became pride. Madam C.J. Walker's legacy lived on in every bottle of homemade hair tonic, every straightening comb passed from mother to daughter. Even death was different in Black America. Funeral homes became sacred spaces run by black families, offering dignity in burial that the world denied in life. The caskets were often handmade, the suits donated, but the ceremonies were regal, because everyone deserved to be remembered with honor, no matter how cruel the world had been. Some of the most courageous were the undocumented resistors, the mothers who shielded their sons from mobs, the pastors who hid fugitives in their attics, The girls who lied about their age to clean houses and feed siblings. Their names didn't survive the archives, but their impact did. They left fingerprints on every movement that came after. And we must remember the young ones, the children who played in alleys, built toys from scrap wood, and laughed even as the world crumbled around them. They grew up fast. Too fast. Too fast. Many were pushed into work by 12 or 13. Some saw friends lynched. Others never made it to high school. But those who did, those who graduated in hand-me-down gowns, became the vanguard of a new era. They carried the memory of the 1930s in their bones, and with it, a fire that would one day light Montgomery, Birmingham, Watts, and beyond. This wasn't just survival. It was a declaration that we are here, that we matter, that our lives, though forgotten by the textbooks, shaped the spine of America. These 100 forgotten things, from the porch prayers to the midnight organizing, from the whispered songs to the loud silences, are not just history. They are testimony. They are a mirror held up to a nation still struggling to reckon with its truth. If you close your eyes, you might still hear it. The shuffling of shoes on a dirt road. The soft hum of a hymn that's traveled continents. The rustle of a page turned in a classroom that wasn't supposed to exist. The last note of a song sung in defiance, floating up from the back pew of a wooden church. Remember these things. Speak their names. Tell their stories. Because history does not belong to the powerful alone. It belongs to the brave, to the ones who endured, to the ones who created joy in the middle of sorrow, who found power in poverty, and who walked forward even when every sign said stop. This was 1930s America, as lived by black souls whose lives mattered then and must matter now. These 100 forgotten things